In 2015, Topshop dressed a generation. Its Oxford Circus flagship pulled in tens of thousands of shoppers a day, more footfall in a single store than most of London's tourist attractions. By 2021, every one of its British stores had closed. Queues once formed before dawn for a single collaboration with Kate Moss. Shoppers flew in from across Europe just to walk its floors and be seen carrying the bag. Topshop wasn't simply a shop. It was where an entire generation of young women worked out who they wanted to be. Then, within a matter of months, the company that had defined the British high street for half a century collapsed into administration. Its new owner didn't buy a single one of its shops. How does a brand with more than 500 stores across 30 countries vanish from the high street almost overnight? The answer says as much about the death of British retail itself as it does about Topshop. Topshop was never built around a single visionary founder in a garage, the way so many retail legends are told. Its origins are quieter and in some ways more revealing of the industry that made it. In 1964, a small youth-focused clothing department opened its doors inside Peter Robinson, a well-established department store chain on Oxford Street, London. That department store belonged to the Burton Group, a menswear-turned retail empire founded decades earlier by Sir Montague Burton, a Lithuanian-born immigrant who had built one of Britain's largest tailoring businesses from nothing. The idea behind this new department was simple, almost modest. Give young shoppers, largely overlooked by mainstream fashion retail, a space designed entirely for them. London in the mid-1960s was a city in the middle of a cultural earthquake. Carnaby Street was rewriting the rules of youth fashion. Music, mods, and a booming teenage population with real spending power for the first time were reshaping what British high street sold and to whom. Into that moment stepped this small department, quietly betting that young people didn't want scaled-down versions of their parents' clothing. They wanted something that belonged to them alone. For its first decade, the department operated inside Peter Robinson's shadow, testing ideas, refining what young fashion actually meant on a British high street. It sold affordable, trend-driven pieces at a pace that mainstream retailers of the era simply weren't built for. The bet paid off. By 1974, the department had grown confident and successful enough to be spun out as its own standalone brand. Topshop. That name mattered. It was direct, unpretentious, and unmistakably aimed at a younger customer who wanted fashion without ceremony. Unlike the grand department stores of the period, with their formal counters and hush service, Topshop was designed to feel immediate. Walk in, find something new, try it, buy it, move on with your week. It was retail built for a generation that wanted speed and self-expression in equal measure. The core belief driving the brand in these early years was straightforward, even if no single figure ever stated it as a personal manifesto. Fashion should move as fast as youth culture itself, and it should be priced so that a shop assistant could afford to dress like the customer standing beside her. That principle, democratic, trend-driven, relentlessly current, would go on to define the brand for the next 4 decades. By the mid-1970s, Topshop had already begun opening standalone stores beyond London, carrying that founding instinct with it. Watch what the street is wearing, then get it onto rails faster than anyone else. It was an unglamorous origin story compared to the mythologized founders of other retail giants, but it was, in its own way, perfectly suited to what Topshop would become. A brand built not around one person's ego, but around a single, sharp instinct for what young Britain wanted to wear next. That instinct would carry Topshop through the 1980s and 1990s, sharpening with every passing trend cycle until it collided with a moment in the early 2000s when British fashion itself seemed to orbit around one address on Oxford Circus. By the early 2000s, Topshop had stopped being simply a shop. It had become an event. The turning point arrived when Sir Philip Green's Arcadia Group took control of the business in 2002, and with new investment behind it, Topshop began pushing its ambitions further than any British high street fashion brand had gone before. The flagship at Oxford Circus was expanded into something closer to a fashion department store than a chain outlet. Several floors, tens of thousands of square feet, a store so large that finding your way around it on a Saturday afternoon became part of the ritual itself. At its peak, that single building was reported to welcome well over 30,000 shoppers on its busiest days, making it one of the highest footfall fashion stores anywhere in the world. Then came Topshop Unique. Starting in 2005, Topshop did something no other high street chain had dared. It staged its own show at London Fashion Week, alongside the luxury houses and designer names that had always treated fast fashion as beneath serious attention. It was a deliberate act of ambition, proof that a brand selling 20-pound dresses could sit in the same room, on the same schedule, as the designers shaping the following season's runways. Editors attended, photographers queued outside. For a brand built on democratic pricing, it was a striking claim to cultural relevance. That claim reached its most famous expression in May 2007, when Topshop launched a collaboration with Kate Moss, one of the most recognizable faces in British fashion, and, at the time, one of its most controversial. The collection sold out within minutes of going on sale. Customers had queued outside stores overnight to secure a place near the rails when doors opened. It wasn't simply a clothing launch, it was a cultural moment, covered by news outlets far beyond the fashion press. And it cemented an idea that would define Topshop for the next decade. This was a brand that could turn a single collection into a nationwide talking point. Growth followed at a pace few British retailers had managed before. By the early 2010s, Topshop had grown to more than 500 stores across over 30 countries, spanning department store concessions, standalone flagships, and franchise partnerships from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. In 2009, it opened a flagship on Broadway in New York, a calculated statement that a British high street label could compete directly on American soil. A rare move for a chain of its kind, and one that, for a period, appeared to be working. For the young women who shopped there through these years, Topshop occupied a particular place that few other retailers managed to hold. It wasn't luxury, and it never pretended to be. But it moved fast enough and looked sharp enough that wearing something from Topshop on a Saturday night carried a kind of currency among friends. The sense of being current, of having caught a trend before the rest of the high street had it on the rails. Staff working the shop floor during these years often described a similar pull. This was the place things happened first, and being part of that, even from behind a till, carried its own quiet status. Topshop also worked hard to make its cultural weight feel earned rather than manufactured. It partnered not only with celebrities, but with emerging British design talent. Christopher Kane, Mary Katransu, Richard Nicole, giving graduate designers a commercial platform most young talents could never otherwise reach. For a brand accused, fairly or not, of chasing trends rather than setting them, these partnerships were a deliberate answer. Proof that Topshop sat closer to the creative pulse of British fashion than its price tag suggested. By the middle of the 2010s, Topshop was no longer simply Britain's most successful fashion retailer. It had become something closer to a national institution of youth culture. A brand mentioned in music lyrics, referenced on television, discussed in fashion magazines alongside names many times its price. Its Oxford Circus doors had become, for an entire generation of British shoppers, something like a rite of passage. None of that success, however, addressed a question already beginning to stir quietly beneath the surface. One that would, within less than a decade, prove impossible to outrun. Success on Oxford Street was one thing. Turning that success into a national, then international network was another challenge entirely. And it was one Arcadia Group pursued with real aggression once Topshop's cultural momentum became undeniable in the mid-2000s. The expansion strategy rested on two distinct tracks running in parallel. At home, Topshop pushed beyond its traditional high street locations into Britain's shopping centers, chasing footfall as consumer habits shifted away from town centers toward out-of-town malls. Stores opened in retail destinations like the Bullring in Birmingham and Westfield, London, positioning Topshop not just as a high street name, but as an anchor tenant capable of drawing shoppers into an entire shopping center on its own. Internationally, the model changed considerably. Rather than opening and operating every overseas store directly, Topshop leaned heavily on franchise partnerships and wholesale agreements, licensing its name and stock to local operators across the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. This was the only realistic way to scale a British fashion brand across dozens of markets simultaneously. Franchise partners understood local property markets, local consumer habits, and local regulation far better than a head office in London ever could. It meant Topshop's name could appear on a mall in Dubai or Kuala Lumpur without Arcadia carrying the full financial risk of that expansion itself. A third and increasingly important channel came through department store concessions, dedicated Topshop sections operating inside larger retailers rather than as standalone shops. This model proved particularly significant in the United States, where in 2012 Topshop struck a landmark partnership with Nordstrom, placing concessions inside the American department store's locations alongside a limited number of standalone Topshop stores. It was a calculated way to enter the notoriously difficult American market without the enormous capital outlay of a nationwide store rollout. Let an established American retailer bring the customers, and let Topshop bring the product. The speed of this growth was, by British retail standards, extraordinary. Within roughly a decade, Topshop moved from a respected domestic chain to a genuinely global name. Its stores or concessions eventually present in more than 30 countries. Few British fashion retailers before it had achieved anything close to that international footprint, and fewer still had done it while maintaining the perception of a brand still rooted in one specific London postcode. That speed came with real tension, however. Maintaining a consistent identity across hundreds of locations, from a flagship the size of a department store to a modest concession corner inside an overseas mall, was never straightforward. Franchise partners operated with a degree of independence that made it harder for London to guarantee the exact shopping experience customers associated with Oxford Circus. Stock levels, store design, and even the pace of new arrivals could vary noticeably between a UK high street branch and an international franchise location, subtly diluting the sense of immediacy that had made Topshop distinctive in the first place. For employees, this era of expansion carried a similar duality. For many, it meant genuine opportunity. New stores meant new management roles. New markets meant international career paths that simply hadn't existed at a British fashion retailer a decade earlier. Staff who joined the shop floor in the early 2000s could, within a few years, find themselves training teams in newly opened franchise territories or helping launch concessions in an American department store thousands of miles from where they started. But it also meant pressure. Rapid growth demanded rapid consistency, and head office expectations for how a Topshop store should look, feel, and perform didn't always account for how different those markets actually were. By the early 2010s, the original Oxford Street department that had opened quietly inside Peter Robinson back in 1964 had become the anchor of a genuinely global retail network, one built not around owning every square foot of selling space, but around exporting an idea fast enough and widely enough that it could outpace almost anyone trying to copy it. That network, however, was about to face a shift in how people shopped altogether, one that no franchise agreement or concession deal would be able to fully answer. By 2012, Topshop had stopped being simply a successful retailer and had become something closer to a fixture of British cultural life. A name that appeared as comfortably in a fashion magazine as it did in a pop lyric, a soap opera script, or a tabloid headline about the latest queue outside Oxford Circus. That year marked the brand's clearest peak. Topshop was operating more than 500 stores across over 30 countries, a scale unmatched by any previous British fashion retailer. The flagship at Oxford Circus alone had grown into the largest fashion store in the world by floor space, spread across multiple levels, and drawing reported crowds of 30,000 or more shoppers on its busiest Saturdays. Numbers that rivaled major tourist attractions rather than typical retail outlets. The single moment that best captured this cultural saturation arrived not on a shop floor, but on a catwalk. In September 2013, Topshop unveiled a hologram of Kate Moss at its London Fashion Week show, a technically ambitious, headline-grabbing spectacle that placed the brand's most famous collaborator, quite literally, center stage among the world's most scrutinized runways. It was covered internationally, not simply by fashion press, but by mainstream news outlets fascinated by the stunt itself. For a brand that had started life as a youth department inside someone else's department store, Sharing a Fashion Week schedule with the world's most exclusive luxury houses was no longer a novelty. It was expected. What made this period different from ordinary commercial success was how deeply Topshop had embedded itself into the rhythm of ordinary British life, particularly for young women navigating school, university, and early adulthood. For many, a trip into central London wasn't complete without at least walking through Oxford Circus, even if nothing was bought. Saturday visits became a ritual passed between friends and increasingly between generations. Mothers who had shopped there in the 1980s bringing daughters who now queued for the same fitting rooms, separated by decades but drawn by the same instinct. This was where the next thing arrived first. Staff who worked the shop floor during these years often recalled a particular intensity to the job that set it apart from ordinary retail work. New stock could arrive daily rather than weekly, a pace almost unheard of in fashion retail at the time, meaning employees themselves were often among the first people in the country to see what was about to define the next fortnight's trends. There was a kind of quiet pride in that, being close to the center of something that mattered to so many people, even from behind a till or a fitting room door. Topshop's cultural weight extended beyond its own stores too. It became something of a civic reference point in its own right, a shorthand that film and television writers reached for when they needed to signal a character as young, current, and British. Its name required no explanation on air. Audiences simply understood what shopping there meant about a person and what it meant about the world they belonged to. Yet perhaps the most telling measure of Topshop's reach came from an ocean away. When the brand opened its flagship on Broadway in 2009 and later expanded its partnership with Nordstrom in 2012, it wasn't simply chasing new revenue. It was making a statement that a fast, democratically priced British label could hold its own in the most competitive fashion market on earth. And for a period, remarkably, it appeared to be true. American shoppers who had only read about Topshop in magazines could now walk into a department store in their own city and buy the same dress being queued for in London. This was the high point the brand would be remembered for, a moment when a shop that had begun as a modest youth department inside someone else's store had become, arguably, the single most influential name in accessible fashion anywhere in the world. Nothing about its position in 2013 suggested vulnerability. Its stores were full, its runway shows made headlines. Its name was, for a generation of young women, simply synonymous with getting dressed. But cultural dominance of this kind rarely announces its own expiry date. Even as Topshop's hologram lit up a runway in September 2013, a handful of much smaller, far less glamorous competitors were quietly building something that would prove within only a few years considerably harder to compete with than any luxury house ever could. In the summer of 2013, while Topshop's Kate Moss hologram was still making headlines around the world, a very different kind of company was quietly reshaping the industry it competed in. ASOS, an online-only fashion retailer barely more than a decade old, had just crossed £1 billion in annual sales. It had no flagship store, no Oxford Circus address, no runway show at London Fashion Week. It didn't need one. Its entire business lived on a screen, and it was growing faster than Topshop ever had. This was the crack that mattered most, even if almost nobody shopping on Oxford Circus that year would have noticed it. Topshop's business, for all its cultural dominance, remained built overwhelmingly around physical retail. A network of expensively rented stores, flagship spectacle, and footfall. That model had been the source of its power for nearly a decade. It was about to become its greatest liability. The shift wasn't sudden. Online shopping had been growing steadily throughout the 2000s. But for a brand as culturally dominant as Topshop, it was easy to treat e-commerce as a supplementary channel rather than an existential threat. Why redesign a business model that was filling stores to capacity and making international headlines? Topshop did launch and grow its own online store during these years, and it was, in absolute terms, a significant part of the business. But the comparison that mattered wasn't Topshop's own year-on-year online growth. It was the pace at which competitors built for the internet from day one were pulling ahead. ASOS, Boohoo, and Pretty Little Thing weren't retrofitting digital operations onto decades-old store networks. They were building distribution, warehousing, and marketing entirely around a customer who had never needed to visit a physical shop at all, and who increasingly didn't want to. There was a second crack running alongside the first, less visible but arguably more corrosive. The pace of fashion itself was accelerating, past what even Topshop's celebrated speed could match. The company that had once prided itself on getting new stock onto rails daily now found itself competing against online retailers capable of designing, producing, and shipping a new style within a matter of days, sometimes faster than a Topshop buyer could finalize an order for the following season. What had been a genuine competitive advantage in 2005 was, by the mid-2010s, simply the industry baseline that newer, leaner competitors had built their entire operations around. For long-serving employees, the change arrived gradually enough that it rarely felt like a single alarming moment, more a slow accumulation of smaller signs. A shop floor manager who had joined in the early 2000s, back when new stock landed daily in queues formed before opening, might have noticed something different by around 2014. Footfall on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon looking thinner than it once had. Younger colleagues mentioning they'd simply ordered the same item online the night before, rather than making the trip in. None of this showed up as a crisis. It showed up as a slightly quieter shop floor, a slightly smaller queue, a pattern easy to dismiss as a single quiet season, rather than the beginning of something structural. Did anyone inside Arcadia Group see clearly what this pattern meant? The honest answer is complicated. Topshop did invest in its digital operations throughout this period, and its online business was, by most measures, one of the stronger performers within Arcadia Group's wider portfolio. But investment in e-commerce technology was only ever one part of the challenge. The deeper structural problem sat elsewhere, in the enormous, largely fixed cost of maintaining hundreds of physical stores, many on long leases signed years earlier when footfall projections looked very different. A retailer that had built its identity, its flagship spectacle, and a significant share of its cost base around physical space could not simply pivot away from that model overnight. However clearly its leadership might have understood where the industry was heading, there was, too, a quieter irony sitting beneath all of it. The very thing that had made Topshop culturally dominant, the flagship as spectacle, the queue as event, the physical ritual of walking through Oxford Circus, was precisely the thing that newer competitors had no need for and no interest in replicating. ASOS didn't need a hologram. It needed a faster website and a cheaper warehouse. And it built both, methodically, while the wider industry was still watching Topshop's runway shows. None of this looked like collapse in 2013 or 2014. Store numbers were still strong. International expansion was still, on paper, a success story. But beneath the surface, a structural mismatch had opened between the company Topshop had built itself to be and the company its customers were quietly starting to prefer. And that gap, however invisible it remained for the moment, was not one that ambition or nostalgia alone would be able to close. To understand why Topshop's structural cracks were never properly addressed, it helps to look past the shop floor entirely and toward the ownership structure sitting above it. Because the decisions that mattered most in this story weren't made by anyone stacking shelves or designing a summer collection. They were made in boardrooms by people whose priorities didn't always align with the long-term health of the business they controlled. Arcadia Group, Topshop's parent company, was controlled by Sir Philip Green, who had built a reputation as one of Britain's most aggressive retail dealmakers. Green had taken Arcadia private in 2002, and the ownership structure that followed became, in hindsight, one of the most consequential decisions in the entire Topshop story. Arcadia was ultimately owned through Tavita Investments, a holding structure connected to Green's wife, Tina Green, who was resident in Monaco. This arrangement meant that dividends extracted from the business were not subject to UK tax in the way they would have been under a conventional domestic ownership structure. In 2005, Arcadia paid out a dividend of approximately $1.2 billion to its shareholders. At the time, the largest dividend payment in British corporate history. The bulk of that sum went to Tina Green. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary transfer of value out of a business that would, within 15 years, be unable to meet its obligations to its own pension scheme, and would collapse into administration. This is not a matter of speculation or retrospective judgment. It is a matter of public financial record, extensively reported at the time and revisited in detail once Arcadia's later troubles became apparent. The consequence of extracting capital at that scale was not immediately visible. Topshop's stores still looked impressive. Its runway shows still made headlines. But a business carrying significant debt, combined with a large and growing pension deficit, has less room to maneuver when its underlying trading position weakens. And Arcadia's pension scheme deficit would later become one of the defining issues of the group's collapse, estimated at points to run into the hundreds of millions of pounds. There is a version of this story in which someone inside Arcadia saw the digital shift coming clearly enough and pushed hard enough to change course before it was too late. Whether such a person existed and whether they were overruled is genuinely difficult to verify with the same precision as the dividend payments or the pension figures. Internal boardroom debates rarely leave the kind of public paper trail that financial filings do. What can be said with confidence is this: whatever internal advocacy for faster digital transformation existed, it did not translate into a change of strategy fast enough to close the gap that had opened between Topshop and its online native competitors. The company's public statements throughout the mid-2010s continued to emphasize store investment and international expansion rather than a fundamental rebuilding of its digital infrastructure to compete directly with ASOS or Boohoo on their own terms. For employees on the shop floor, none of this boardroom context was visible in any direct way. What they experienced instead was something more immediate and easier to notice: a gradual thinning of investment in the physical stores themselves. Former staff and industry observers described stores that had once been meticulously maintained, fitting rooms refreshed regularly, displays rebuilt for every new campaign, beginning to show the ordinary wear of buildings whose upkeep budgets were no longer being prioritized in the way they once had been. Nothing dramatic, no single closed department or broken escalator that made headlines. Just the slow, almost imperceptible erosion of a shopping environment that had once felt genuinely special, replaced gradually by something closer to ordinary. The clearest human cost of Arcadia's financial structure would not become fully apparent until the very end of the story, when the group's pension scheme, covering tens of thousands of current and former employees across Topshop and Arcadia's other brands, became a central issue in negotiations with the UK's Pension Protection Fund as the company approached collapse. Workers who had spent decades on Topshop shop floors, some since the brand's earliest expansion in the 1970s and 1980s, found their retirement security tied to a pension scheme whose funding position had been shaped, years earlier, by a dividend payment most of them had never even known about at the time it was made. It would be inaccurate to suggest that Arcadia's leadership set out to destroy Topshop, or that any single decision alone guaranteed its collapse. Retail is a genuinely difficult industry, and the shift to e-commerce disrupted businesses far more conservatively managed than Arcadia's, but it would be equally inaccurate to separate Topshop's eventual fall entirely from the financial choices made at the top of the company years before the crisis became visible. A business that had extracted significant capital during its strongest years, while carrying a growing pension obligation, had measurably less room to adapt when the ground beneath it began to shift, less capital to invest in the digital transformation its competitors were pursuing, and less resilience to absorb the shock that was, by 2020, only a few years away. The facts here do not require embellishment. A record dividend paid years before the collapse, a pension deficit that would later require public intervention, a digital transformation that arrived years later than the market demanded. Whatever was happening inside Arcadia's boardroom during these years, the outcome on the shop floor, and eventually on the high street itself, would speak for itself soon enough. The first public sign came on the 30th of November 2020, when Arcadia Group formally filed for administration. Deloitte was appointed to oversee the process, and within hours of the announcement, the number attached to the story became impossible to ignore. Roughly 13,000 jobs across the group now hung in the balance, spread across more than 400 stores under the Arcadia umbrella, including Topshop, Topman, Dorothy Perkins, Wallace, Evans, and Burton. For a business that had once been the loudest name on the British High Street, the announcement itself was almost muted. A formal administration filing, a handful of statements from administrators and government ministers, and a wave of news coverage that treated it less as a shock than as a confirmation of something many in the industry had quietly expected for years. Retail analysts had been warning for months that Arcadia's underlying financial position, weighed down by the debt and pension pressures built up over the preceding decade, made it acutely vulnerable to any serious shock. COVID-19 supplied exactly that shock. Store closures during successive lockdowns throughout 2020 had cut off the physical footfall Topshop's business model still depended on, at precisely the moment the company had the least financial room left to absorb the loss. The unraveling that followed was fast by retail standards, but not instantaneous. Administration is not the same as immediate closure. It is a legal process designed to give a company breathing room while administrators search for buyers, wind down unviable operations, or restructure what remains. For Arcadia's brands, that search played out differently depending on the label. Some fared better than others. Evans found a buyer in City Chic Collective. Dorothy Perkins, Wallace, and Burton were eventually acquired by Boohoo. Though in a pattern that would soon repeat itself with Topshop, Boohoo acquired the brand names and online operations rather than the physical store network. Topshop's fate followed a similar, but even more consequential path. In early February 2021, ASOS confirmed it had reached an agreement to acquire the Topshop, Topman, Miss Selfridge, and Hit brands from Arcadia's administrators in a deal reported at around $265 million. The detail that mattered most to the thousands of people still working on Topshop's shop floors was buried a little deeper in the announcement. ASOS was buying the brand names, the online operations, the stock, and the intellectual property. It was not buying the stores. That single distinction determined almost everything that followed. Roughly 2,500 jobs connected to Topshop's design, buying, and online operations were expected to transfer across to ASOS as part of the deal. A genuine, if partial, continuation of the brand's workforce. But the far larger number of employees working inside Topshop's physical stores, the shop floor staff, the fitting room assistants, the visual merchandisers who had spent years dressing windows on Oxford Circus, had no equivalent lifeline. Their stores were not part of what had been bought. Administrators began the process of winding down Arcadia's remaining physical retail estate, and one by one, Topshop's shops across Britain began preparing to close for the final time. Inside the stores still trading through those final weeks, the atmosphere shifted in a way that longtime staff would later describe as unmistakable, even before any formal closure date had been confirmed for their particular branch. Deliveries slowed. Replenishment of stock became inconsistent. The daily rhythm that had once defined a Topshop shop floor, new arrivals, fast turnover, the sense of being first to see what was coming next, simply stopped. What remained instead were rails growing steadily emptier, discount signage appearing in windows that had once been reserved for campaign imagery, and a quiet understanding among staff that they were now working through the final chapter of something without yet knowing precisely when it would end for them personally. For customers, the experience of Topshop's closing months carried its own particular sadness, distinct from the ordinary closing down sale of a struggling shop. This wasn't simply another retailer disappearing from a high street that had already lost dozens of familiar names in preceding years. For a generation of British women, now in their 30s and 40s, walking past a Topshop with sale signs plastered across its windows meant watching a piece of their own adolescence being liquidated in real time. The same shop where they'd once queued overnight for a Kate Moss collection, now selling off its last stock at a fraction of its original price, with nobody queuing for anything at all. The Oxford Circus flagship itself, once the largest and busiest fashion store in the world, closed its doors for the final time in 2021. There was no grand ceremony, no farewell event of the kind the brand might once have staged for a product launch. Coverage of the closure leaned heavily on nostalgia, with journalists and former shoppers alike reflecting publicly on what the store had meant to them, treating its closure less as ordinary business news and more as the quiet end of an era for London's West End. Several news outlets marked the moment by revisiting the Kate Moss hologram, the overnight queues, the 2013 fashion show, a retrospective tribute running almost as a eulogy alongside the practical reporting of jobs lost and administrators' statements. By the time the last Topshop store in Britain closed its shutters for good, the physical infrastructure that had once spanned the country was gone entirely, while the name itself continued on, in a considerably smaller form, inside ASOS's online platform. It was, in the most literal sense, a company that had survived and died at the same time. Its brand intact, its stock still sold, its shop floors and the tens of thousands of people who had once worked them gone for good. What remained afterward was not a story of total disappearance, the way it had been for some retailers that vanished from the market altogether. It was something stranger and, in some ways, more difficult to sit with. A name once inseparable from a physical place on Oxford Circus, now surviving only as a label on a website, severed entirely from the shop floors, the queues, and the community of staff and shoppers that had once made it mean something. In the years following Topshop's collapse, the physical spaces it left behind told their own quiet story about what British retail had become. The Oxford Circus flagship, once the largest fashion store in the world, sat empty for a period before being reimagined entirely. Its enormous footprint eventually redeveloped for office and mixed-use space, a building whose identity was rewritten from the ground up because there was, quite simply, no single fashion retailer left capable of filling a space that size. Smaller Topshop branches across British high streets and shopping centers met a range of fates. Some were absorbed by expanding competitors, others by discount retailers, and a number sat vacant for months, their old signage stripped away, another blank storefront on high streets already struggling with a wave of pandemic-era closures. The competitors who inherited Topshop's customers were, by this point, unmistakable. ASOS, Boohoo, and Shane, the very online-first retailers whose rise had quietly undermined Topshop's business model years before its collapse became public, were the clear beneficiaries. ASOS's decision to acquire the Topshop name itself was, in some ways, the most telling detail of all. Even the company that had helped accelerate Topshop's decline recognized there was still commercial value in what remained of the brand, provided it could be stripped entirely of the costly physical infrastructure that had once been its greatest strength. Was there ever a genuine attempt to revive Topshop as something more than a website listing? In the years since the ASOS acquisition, the brand has continued to exist in a limited capacity, sold online, occasionally referenced in fashion coverage, its archive still recognizable to anyone who shopped there during its peak, but nothing resembling the physical presence of the 2000s and early 2010s has returned. There has been no announced flagship relaunch, no attempt to rebuild a store network, no pop-up campaign designed to recreate the queues that once formed outside Oxford Circus. Whether that absence reflects a deliberate strategic choice by ASOS or simply the economic reality that rebuilding physical fashion retail at that scale no longer makes commercial sense is difficult to say with certainty. What can be said is that, so far, the revival many former shoppers might have hoped for has not materialized. The broader industry lesson sitting underneath Topshop's collapse is one that has been repeated with variations across British and American retail alike over the past decade. Cultural dominance and commercial survival are not the same thing, and a business can be adored by millions of customers while still carrying a cost structure and ownership arrangement that makes it acutely vulnerable to disruption. Topshop was not undone by declining relevance. Its runway shows, its collaborations, its flagship spectacle all remained culturally significant almost until the very end. It was undone by a mismatch between a physical retail cost base built for one era and a digital shopping reality built for another, compounded by a financial structure that had extracted capital from the business during its strongest years, leaving it with less capacity to adapt when the ground shifted beneath it. The economic impact on the communities that had depended on Topshop extended well beyond the roughly 13,000 jobs lost across Arcadia Group as a whole. High streets and shopping centers that had relied on a Topshop store as an anchor tenant, the kind of name that reliably drew footfall past smaller neighboring shops, lost more than a single retailer when those doors closed. In many towns, a vacant former Topshop became one more piece of evidence in a wider, already visible pattern. The gradual hollowing out of Britain's town center, retail, storefront by storefront, brand by brand, across the years following the 2008 financial crisis and accelerating sharply through the pandemic. For the former employees who had built careers on Topshop's shop floors, some of them since the 1980s, spanning decades of trend cycles and store openings, the aftermath meant very different things depending on where they stood when the doors closed. A smaller number found continuity, transferring into ASOS's design, buying, or digital operations, carrying institutional knowledge of the brand into its new storeless form. For the far larger number who had worked in the physical shops themselves, no such transition existed. Some moved into other retail roles in an industry that was, by 2021, offering fewer and fewer of the kind of shop floor positions that had once defined their careers. Others left retail altogether, taking with them institutional memory of a brand and a way of working that, in its original form, no longer existed anywhere to return to. What then does it mean when a gathering place like this disappears and nothing quite takes its place? Oxford Circus still exists. Shoppers still walk past where the flagship once stood. But the particular thing that store represented, a physical space where an entire generation gathered, queued, and quietly worked out who they wanted to be through what they wore, has not been replaced by anything resembling it, only by the flatter, more solitary experience of scrolling a website alone. Picture a Saturday morning outside Oxford Circus, sometime in the middle of the 2000s, before the doors have even opened. A queue is already forming along the pavement, some there for a new collection, most simply there because Saturday and Topshop had, for as long as they could remember, meant the same thing. Inside, once the doors finally give way, the sound arrives first. Music low enough to talk over. The click of hangers being pushed along a rail, someone calling a size across the shop floor to a colleague 3 departments away. The smell is unmistakable too. New fabric, faint perfume from the beauty counter near the entrance. The particular mix of a building holding thousands of people and thousands of garments under one roof. Escalators carry shoppers up past the floor after floor, each one slightly different, each one worth the climb. A dress is held up against the light near a fitting room mirror. A friend gives her verdict. A decision is made in seconds, the way it always was there. Fast, certain, and entirely of the moment. What Topshop offered underneath the trend cycles and the runway shows and the cues that made headlines was never really about clothing alone. It was a place where young people, mostly young women, were given room to try on versions of themselves before they had to decide who they actually were. A school uniform came off on a Friday, and something chosen entirely by its wearer went on instead. Cheap enough that a mistake cost little, current enough that it felt, however briefly, like keeping pace with a city that moved faster than anywhere else in Britain. For many, the first item bought with their own wages from their first job came off a Topshop rail. For others, it was the place where a group of friends became a group of friends properly, tied together by shared afternoons spent trying on things none of them could quite afford. Laughing in a fitting room queue, walking out with one bag between 4 people, and calling it a success anyway. That mattered more than the balance sheets or the store counts ever could. A high street is not simply a place where transactions happen. It is where a community gathers, argues, chooses, and grows up in public, together, in a way that a delivery arriving quietly at a private address never quite replicates. Topshop, at its best, was one of the last places doing that at genuine national scale. Somewhere a teenager in Newcastle and a teenager in Brighton were, in some small way, having the same Saturday, wearing pieces from the same rails, feeling the same small thrill of choosing something entirely their own. When that kind of shared, physical, communal ritual disappears, what replaces it is rarely worse in any way that shows up in a quarterly report. It is simply quieter, more solitary, and a little less alive. Topshop is gone from the high street now, though its name lingers on, thinner than it once was, inside someone else's website. There is no use pretending that loss and progress were not, in this case, tangled together. That the same convenience which finally closed its doors has also given people things worth having. But something real existed inside those buildings on Oxford Circus and on high streets across the country for the better part of half a century, and it deserves to be remembered honestly rather than mourned sentimentally. To the people who built it, the young department inside Peter Robinson in 1964, the buyers and designers who kept it moving faster than anyone thought a British retailer could, the staff who dressed windows, folded rails, and worked tills through decades of Saturdays. The debt owed is real, even if it was never fully repaid when it mattered most. To the shoppers who queued overnight, who saved wages for a single dress, who found their own style somewhere between those rails, the memory belongs to them entirely, and no closure can take it back. Somewhere today, a woman in her 30s will see an old photograph of herself outside Oxford Circus, bag in hand, and she will remember, for a moment, exactly how that Saturday felt. That is enough. Not every institution needs to survive to have mattered. Topshop mattered to a generation on a high street for a while that felt at the time like it might never end. It ended anyway, but it was real while it lasted, and that is worth saying plainly once, before the story closes for good.